This isn't some story I heard from a friend of a friend. This is my life, the real and brutal truth of what my own children did to me. My son, Julian, slid the document across the polished mahogany table of the conference room at Sterling, Hewitt, and Finch, and I saw the words that ended my life as I knew it. In the matter of the mental incompetency of Franklin Pierce. I was Franklin Pierce. The room was cold, sterile, all glass and chrome, overlooking the gray sprawl of downtown Boston. My daughter, Clara, sat to my right, her hand resting on my forearm in a gesture that would have looked like comfort to any outsider. But I could feel the faint, triumphant tremor in her fingers. They had gathered me here under the pretense of an urgent estate planning meeting, a finalization of the legacy I had spent 40 years building for them. Instead, they had brought me to my own execution. A man I'd never seen before, a Dr. Alastair Finch with a practiced, sympathetic smile and dead eyes, sat opposite me. He was the expert they'd hired, the final nail for my coffin. My own children were trying to have me legally declared a ghost, a non-entity, so they could possess the kingdom I had bled to create. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far a story flows. It had all started with whispers, with a gentle, insidious poison and concern. For 40 years, Pierce & Sons Construction wasn't just a name on a letterhead. It was my blood and my breath carved into the Boston skyline. I'd started with a single beat-up truck and a toolbox my father had left me, sleeping in that truck on cold nights, dreaming of glass towers and sprawling estates. By the time I was 68, we were the premier development firm in New England. I could walk through Beacon Hill and point to a dozen restored brownstones my crew had brought back to life. I could drive out to Weston and see the mansions I'd built from the bedrock up. My wife, Eleanor, had been my partner in it all, the quiet strength behind my ambition. But I lost it to cancer 5 years ago, and in that silence, the whispers from my children began to grow louder. Julian, my son, was all sharp angles and sharper ambition. He had my mind for numbers, but none of my patience. Clara, my daughter, had her mother's grace, but she wielded it like a weapon, a silken glove hiding a fist of iron. They were supposed to be my legacy. Instead, they became my vultures. It began with small things, tiny fissures in the foundation of my reality. "Dad, don't you remember?" Clara would say, her brow furrowed with that perfect mask of loving worry. "We had that meeting with the Henderson Group yesterday. You were supposed to sign the zoning variance." I'd have no memory of it, my mind a complete blank. I'd search my calendar, my notes, a rising tide of panic in my chest. Nothing. She would sigh a soft, disappointed sound and say, "Don't worry, I handled it." She was always handling things. My schedule, my appointments, my correspondence. She called it lightening my load, but now I see it was sabotage. She was erasing my world one meeting at a time, making me seem forgetful, unreliable, a step behind. Julian played his part from the financial side. He took over the quarterly reports, presented me with simplified, glossy summaries. "Just the top-line stuff for you, Dad. No need to get bogged down in the weeds." I, a man who once knew every dollar, every invoice, every bid margin by heart, was being gently nudged out of my own control room. I trusted them. That was my fatal flaw. Why wouldn't I? I had given them everything. Summers in Martha's Vineyard, Ivy League educations, corner offices with sweeping views of the city I'd built. I thought their ambition was a reflection of my own. I never imagined it was aimed at my back. The suspicion started as a cold knot in my stomach. I'd overhear snippets of conversations that would stop the moment I entered a room. Board members who once greeted me with warmth now offered tight, pitying smiles. They were all looking at me like I was already a memory. The final, horrifying proof came when my longtime assistant Maria retired. They threw her a small party in the office. As I was leaving, she pulled me aside, her eyes filled with a fear I didn't understand. She pressed a small, worn leather-bound book into my hand. It was my old daily planner from the previous year, one I thought I'd lost. "Clara said you didn't need this anymore," Maria whispered. "She gave me a new digital calendar to manage for you. But Frank, Some of the entries don't match. That night, I sat in my study, the leather book in one hand and my company-issued tablet in the other. I cross-referenced them. The book, in my own handwriting, listed a 10 a.m. meeting with the Henderson Group. The digital calendar, managed by Clara, was blank for that entire day. There were dozens of discrepancies. Canceled meetings I'd never canceled. Agreements I'd supposedly made on days I was out of town. It wasn't my mind that was failing. It was a coup, meticulously planned and ruthlessly executed. The ground beneath my feet wasn't just shaking. It had vanished entirely, and I was in a free fall. The meeting with the psychiatrist was their checkmate. They'd spent a year building a case brick by brick, lie by lie, creating the fiction of my decline. And I, the master builder, had never even seen the blueprint for my own destruction. They presented their evidence with solemn faces, missed appointments, confused emails I'd apparently sent, testimony from board members they'd already turned. They had me cornered, and the temporary conservatorship was granted almost immediately. Legally, I was no longer the head of my company or the master of my own fortune. I was a ward of my own children. They moved me out of the family home in Brookline, the house I'd built for Eleanor, and into a sterile luxury apartment downtown. They gave me a generous allowance, a gilded cage. They controlled everything. My letters, my phone calls, my visitors. They were untouchable, sitting on my throne, wearing my crown. For a month, I drowned in that despair. I was Frank Pierce, a lion of Boston business, reduced to a confused old man whose children had to manage his affairs. That was the story they sold the world, and the world bought it. The magazines that once celebrated my success now ran hushed, sympathetic articles about the tragic decline of a titan. Julian gave a particularly heartbreaking interview to the Boston Globe, talking about the difficulty of watching a great mind fade. I read it on a tablet they provided me, and the rage that filled me was so pure, so cold, it burned away all the grief. They hadn't just stolen my company. They had stolen my name, my history, my very identity. They thought the fight was over. They thought they had won. But sitting there in that silent white apartment, I realized they had made one critical miscalculation. They had forgotten what I was at my core. I wasn't just a businessman. I was a builder. And if they had torn my world down, I would simply have to build a new one from the ashes. A world where they paid for every single lie. My resolve settled not like a storm, but like the dead, quiet cold of New England winter. My children believed they had buried their father. They were about to learn they had only planted a monster. The first step was to break out of my cage. My keepers were a rotating staff of nurses and assistants, all hired by Clara, all reporting back to her. They monitored my calls, my web history, everything, but they were young, complacent, and they underestimated me. They saw a docile old man. They didn't see the gears turn behind my eyes. I started my performance. I'd forget things, names, where I put my glasses, what I had for breakfast. I'd shuffle my feet when I walked. I played the part they had written for me so perfectly that they relaxed their guard. My weapon was a burner phone, bought for $50 cash from a kid in a convenience store. During my one supervised walk a day in the Boston Public Garden, I faked a dizzy spell near a restroom. The young assistant panicked, getting me water. In those 90 seconds of confusion, I made my move. I ducked into a Copley Square pharmacy, bought the phone, and stashed it in my coat lining. It was a small act of rebellion, but it felt like taking back the world. That night, with the phone pressed in my ear under a blanket in my sterile bedroom, I made the first real call I'd made in months. The man I called was not a lawyer or a doctor. His name was Sal Gallo. I hadn't spoken to Sal in 30 years, but men like him have long memories. Back when Pierce Construction was just me, a hammer and a prayer, I needed a loan to secure the materials for my first big contract. No bank would touch me. Sal did. He ran the unions in the darker corners of the North End, a ghost from Boston's old violent past. The loan was steep, the terms unforgiving, but I paid back every single dime, plus interest, on time. Sal respected that. He respected strength and honored debts. "Mr. Gallo," I said, my voice low, "it's Frank Pierce." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the sound of crackling static. Then a low, gravelly voice I hadn't heard in decades. "Frankie, I thought you were swimming with the swells on Beacon Hill. Don't tell me you're calling to borrow money again." "Worse," I said. "I'm calling about a matter of family. About blood. My children, they've disrespected me. They've stolen my name." There was another silence. For men like Sal, family and respect weren't just words. They were the pillars of their entire world. An offense against a father by his own children was a cardinal sin. "Tell me everything," he said. And so I did. I told him about the gaslighting, the legal ambush, the gilded cage. I didn't ask for violence. I didn't need it. What I needed was information. I needed a ghost who could walk through walls I could no longer access. I needed to know what my children were really doing with the empire I had built. Sal listened without interruption. When I was finished, he said only 2 words. "I'll listen." That was all I needed. A week later, a plain manila envelope was left for me by a courier at the front desk of my building. Inside was a treasure trove. Sal's people were quiet, invisible, and terrifyingly efficient. They had uncovered the rot beneath the pristine surface of my children's lives. Julian, it turned out, had a secret, a multi-million-dollar gambling habit. He owed colossal debts to online casinos based out of Macau and some very unpleasant private bookmakers much closer to home. He'd been embezzling from the company for months, funneling money through dummy invoices and shell corporations, a trick I recognized because I'd seen a more primitive version of it pulled by my competitors decades ago. He was using Pierce & Sons as his personal piggy bank to cover his addiction. And Clara, my perfect, graceful Clara, she was sleeping with Marcus Thorne, the CEO of our biggest rival, Sterling Homes. Phone records and hotel receipts confirmed it. She was leaking proprietary information, bid details, material costs, land acquisition plans, giving Thorne the inside track on every major project we were competing for. She wasn't just helping him. She was actively sabotaging her own company for a promised executive position at Sterling once Pierce & Sons was weak enough for a hostile takeover. They weren't just taking over the company. They were gutting it from the inside out, selling it for parts while I watched from a window. The documents in that envelope were the ammunition. Now I had to choose my weapon. The courts were too slow, too public. The police would launch an investigation that could drag on for years, and by then, the company would be a hollowed-out shell. No, this wasn't a matter for the law. This was a matter of family. And there was one man whose judgment they feared more than any judge, their maternal grandfather, Alistair Cromwell. Alistair Cromwell was old money incarnate. He lived in a sprawling ancestral estate in the Berkshires, a world away from the grit and sweat of my own origins. He had never fully approved of me, a rough-hewn builder who married his daughter, but he adored Eleanor and, by extension, had a grudging respect for the empire I had built for her children. Alistair was the patriarch of a dynasty, a man for whom legacy, honor, and the family name were more valuable than currency. He controlled a vast family trust, a safety net of inherited wealth that Julian and Clara had always taken for granted. They saw him as a relic, a stuffy old man to be managed with polite visits and holiday cards. They had no idea he was a shark, older and more patient than them, but a shark nonetheless. Getting a message to him was the next challenge. I couldn't call him directly. My children monitored all official channels. But I knew Alistair had a weakness, his collection of antique clocks. He employed a master craftsman, a man named Mr. Schmidt from a small shop in Cambridge, to maintain them. I had met him once with Eleanor years ago. Using my burner phone, I called the shop. I didn't say who I was. I simply told Mr. Schmidt that Alistair Cromwell's prized 18th century regulator clock, a wedding gift from Eleanor and me, had a critical flaw in its escapement mechanism that only I knew how to identify. I told him to pass on a message. The builder has found a crack in the foundation of the house. It's urgent. It was a cryptic message, but I knew Alistair would understand the subtext. 2 days later, a black town car, the kind that doesn't announce its presence, pulled up outside my apartment building. A driver in a simple dark suit stepped out and informed my minder at the front desk that Mr. Cromwell had requested my presence for a family health consultation. The order was ironclad, coming from a source my children's lawyers couldn't possibly contest without causing a massive family scandal. The drive out to the Berkshires was silent. The city fell away, replaced by the deep greens and golds of the western Massachusetts autumn. As we pulled up the long, gravel driveway to the Cromwell estate, I felt a grim sense of finality. This was it, the war room. Alistair was waiting for me in his library, a cavernous room paneled with dark wood and filled with the quiet ticking of 100 clocks. He was a tall, skeletal man in his late 80s, his eyes as sharp and clear as ice. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Schmidt said you found a crack," he said, his voice dry as autumn leaves. I placed a manila envelope Sal Gallo had given me on the polished surface of his desk. "The whole foundation is rotten," I said. For the next hour, he read. He examined the bank statements, showing Julian's embezzled funds. He studied the phone records and hotel receipts detailing Clara's treachery. His expression never changed, but I could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. He was a man watching his own bloodline curdle. When he was done, he folded his hands and looked at me a long, appraising stare. He was looking for weakness, for a hint of emotional hysterics. He found none. He saw the same cold, hard resolve in my eyes that he likely saw in his own mirror every morning. "They used my doctors, my lawyers," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "They leveraged the Cromwell name to lend credibility to their petition of incompetence. The betrayal was not just against me. It was against him. They had used his reputation as a weapon." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the manicured lawns that had been his family for 200 years. The quiet ticking of the clocks seemed to grow louder, counting down the seconds to my children's ruin. "Family gatherings are so rare these days," Alistair said, his back still to me. "I believe it is time we had one. A dinner, this Sunday. Here, you will be in attendance. I will make the arrangements." It wasn't a question. It was a judgment being passed. He was summoning them to their own execution, and I would be there to watch the axe fall. The drive back to Boston felt different. The air in the car was no longer thick with despair, but with the electric hum of impending vengeance. Alistair's chauffeur dropped me back at my gilded cage, but it no longer felt like a prison. It was a staging ground. For the next few days, I played my part with renewed vigor. I was more forgetful, more confused, the perfect picture of a fading patriarch. Clara called me to inform me of the dinner at her grandfather's. Her voice was laced with saccharine sweetness that now turned my stomach. "Grandfather is so worried about you, Daddy," she cooed. "He wants to see for himself how you're doing. Julian and I will be right there with you, of course. We'll make sure you're comfortable." They had no idea. They thought they were walking into a final confirmation of their victory, a chance to parade their dutiful concern in front of the family patriarch and solidify their control. They thought he had summoned me for inspection. They didn't realize he had summoned them for a reckoning. Sunday evening arrived, painted in the fiery colors of New England sunset. Julian and Clara picked me up, their car a gleaming new German sedan bought with my money. They were dressed in expensive, somber clothes, the very picture of concerned heirs. Julian was confident, a smug, triumphant smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Clara was fussing over my tie, her touch now feeling like a spider's crawl on my skin. As we drove west, they rehearsed their lines, whispering about how to handle my episodes in front of their grandfather. They were so busy congratulating themselves on their cleverness that they never once looked into my eyes. If they had, they wouldn't have seen a confused old man. They would have seen a hunter waiting patiently by the water's edge. We arrived at the Cromwell estate as darkness fell. The house was lit from within, casting a golden glow onto sprawling lawns. Inside, the scene was set not for a cozy family dinner, but for a tribunal. Alistair was seated at the head of the long, formal dining table. He wasn't alone. To his right sat his personal lawyer, a man whose face was as sharp and unforgiving as a hawk's. To his left was a forensic accountant. The table was not set with fine china, but with 3 thick, leather-bound folders. My folder, Julian's, and Clara's. Julian and Clara froze in the doorway, their practiced smiles faltering as they took in scene. The air was thick with a deadly silence, broken only by the ticking of clocks in the library down the hall. "Julian." "Clara," Alistair said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Sit." It was a command, not an invitation. They sat, their confidence visibly evaporating, replaced by a dawning, sickening dread. They looked from their grandfather to the lawyers, then to me. I met their gaze and held it, my expression a perfect, calm blank. For the first time, they looked truly afraid. They finally realized this wasn't their party. This was mine. Alistair let the silence stretch, a form of torture he had perfected over decades in boardrooms and backroom deals. He let their fear marinate, let them contemplate the trap they had so arrogantly walked into. "I have been reviewing the state of the family's affairs," he began, his voice cutting to the tension like a shard of glass. "Specifically, the affairs of Pearson's sons. And I have found discrepancies." He gestured to his lawyer, who opened the first folder. It was Julian's. The lawyer began to speak in a calm, dispassionate monotone, detailing the dates, the times, and the exact amounts of money funneled from company accounts into offshore gambling sites. He listed the shell corporations, the falsified invoices, the millions of dollars stolen to feed a sordid and pathetic addiction. Julian's face went white, then a blotchy, mottled red. He started to stammer, to deny it, but Alistair raised a single skeletal finger, and Julian fell silent, choking on his own lies. Then the lawyer turned to Clara. He opened the second folder. He read excerpts from text messages between her and Marcus Thorne. He detailed the specific bid information she had leaked, cross-referencing it with the contract Sterling Holmes had subsequently won. He showed the hotel bookings, the gifts, the clear, irrefutable evidence of her corporate espionage and betrayal. Clara began to sob, not tears of remorse, but tears of pure, unadulterated panic. Her mask of grace shattered, revealing the ugly, grasping greed beneath. They turned to me then, their eyes wild with desperation, as if hoping I would intervene, save them, be the loving father they had just spent a year destroying. I said nothing. I just watched. I watched the empire of lies they had built crumble to dust in the space of 10 minutes. "You have not only committed crimes against the law," Alistair said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You have committed a crime against this family. You have spat on your mother's memory. You have defiled the name of Cromwell and the name of Pierce." He paused, letting the weight of his words crush them. "Effective immediately, you are both cut off from the Cromwell family trust. Your names will be struck from my will. You are no longer my grandchildren." It was a death sentence of a kind, the end of their social standing, their financial security, their entire world. But he wasn't finished. "As for the embezzlement and the corporate espionage," he continued, gesturing to forensic accountant, "a full report, along with all supporting evidence, will be delivered to the district attorney's office at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning." The finality of it hung in the air, not just disowned, but destroyed, facing prison time, public disgrace, and utter ruin. Clara let out a strangled wail, while Julian just stared at his hands on the table, a man already in his own coffin. In that moment, watching their world burn down around them, I felt nothing. No pity, no satisfaction, not even anger, just a vast, empty calm. The debt had been paid. Alistair turned his icy gaze to me. "Frank," he said, "the conservatorship will be dissolved by the end of the week. My lawyers will handle it." I simply nodded. The battle was over. As the lawyers escorted my 2 sobbing, broken children from the room, Alistair and I sat alone in the echoing silence. "They have destroyed 40 years of your work," he said quietly. I looked out the dark window, and my own reflection superimposed over the ancient, manicured grounds of his estate. I had risen from the dirt, and he had been born on a silk pillow, but in the end, we both understood the simple, brutal arithmetic of power and betrayal. "No," I said, my voice steady for the first time in a year. They only reminded me how to build. The resolution was chilling in its efficiency. Julian and Clara were arrested 2 weeks later. The scandal was immense, a feast for the Boston tabloids. Their faces, once splashed across society pages, were now grainy mugshots. Julian took a plea deal, his testimony against Clara ensuring he'd get a lighter sentence. She tried to fight it, but the evidence was insurmountable. The company was placed into a temporary trust, managed by a team Alistair appointed, to stabilize it before I decided its future. I never went back to being the CEO. I didn't want it. I had already built that empire once. I took a small office, acting as a consultant, helping the new team prune the dead branches my children had left behind. Sometimes, late at night, I sit in that office overlooking the city lights, the skyline I etched into the clouds. I don't think about my son in a low-security prison or my daughter fighting appeals from a world she no longer recognizes. I think about the nature of creation and destruction. They say blood is thicker than water, but they never tell you how easily it washes away. The end.